The cathedral smelled like white roses and expensive perfume. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows and fractured into color across the marble floor. A string quartet played somewhere near the altar. Something classical, something soft. The kind of music that made women press their hands to their chests and men stand up a little straighter. 200 guests filled the pews in their finest clothes, silk and linen and pearls, all of them turned toward the entrance with cameras raised and smiles already forming. It was, by every measure, a perfect wedding. The bride appeared in the doorway, and the room responded the way rooms always do when something genuinely beautiful enters them. A collective exhale, a few gasps. Someone's grandmother started crying before the processional had even properly begun. The bride moved slowly, deliberately, white dress catching the light with every step, bouquet of pale roses held steady in both hands. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. And then the doors opened. Not the doors the bride had come through. The massive wooden doors at the back of the cathedral, the ones that had been shut, the ones that were supposed to stay shut, swung open without warning, and a man walked in. He wore a black suit, no tie, dark hair. A stillness about him that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with control. The string quartet stopped mid-note, not gradually, not politely. The music simply ceased, as though the instruments themselves understood something the players didn't. The guests nearest the back turned first, and something moved across their faces. Not curiosity, not irritation at the interruption, something older and more animal than that. Recognition followed immediately by a very specific kind of fear, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply arrives. It spread through the pews like a current, row by row, face by face. The groom, standing at the altar, saw the change in his guests before he saw the man. He followed their eyes. His hand, which had been relaxed at his side, closed into a slow fist. The bride stopped walking. Her bouquet, which she had been holding so steadily, began to tremble. The man in the black suit didn't hurry. He didn't scan the room the way nervous men do. He looked at the altar, the way a person looks at something they've already processed, already decided about, already filed away. He stood there for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, 200 people forgot how to breathe. His name moved through the cathedral in whispers that were somehow louder than speech. Lorenzo Moretti, the most feared man in Italy, the man who had loved the bride 7 years ago, before everything went wrong, before the silence, before the kind of ending that doesn't feel like an ending because no one ever said a word. He had not come to stop the wedding. He had not come to win her back. He had come for something quieter than either of those things. But what he was about to see, he could not have prepared for. Not in 7 years. Not in a lifetime. It would stop him cold. To understand what Lorenzo Moretti was doing in that cathedral, you need to understand what kind of man he was, and what kind of man he had been before the world made him into something else. The Moretti name had meant something in Italy for 3 generations. His grandfather had built the foundation, quietly, ruthlessly, with the patience of a man who understood that real power is never loud. His father had expanded it. By the time Lorenzo inherited the organization at 26, there was nothing left to prove, and no one willing to challenge him long enough to try. Governments tracked him. Rival families negotiated carefully around him. Law enforcement in 4 countries had files on him that they added to regularly and acted on never. He was not feared because he was violent. Violent men were common. He was feared because he was precise, because he never moved without reason, because when Lorenzo Moretti made a decision, it had already been made 3 steps ago, and by the time anyone else caught up, it was simply done. That was the man the world knew, The man almost no one knew was the one who had loved Elisa Ferrante. She had come into his life through an introduction at a gallery opening, the kind of social event he attended for appearances and endured like a slow tax. She had been standing in front of a painting he didn't understand, explaining it to no one in particular, talking to it the way some people talk to plants. He had listened for 4 minutes before she noticed him. She hadn't flinched at his name. She had tilted her head and said, "Do you actually like art, or do you just own it?" He had thought about that question for 3 days. She was not from his world. She had no interest in his world. She was a primary school teacher from Florence, who read too many books and laughed at things that weren't conventionally funny, and brought an easiness into every room she entered that Lorenzo, who had spent his entire adult life managing rooms, had never once produced himself. He loved her the way men like him love things they don't fully understand, carefully at first, then completely, then in a way that scared him, because it was the one area of his life where he had no control and didn't want any. For 2 years, she was the only soft thing in a hard empire. Then the file arrived, a thick envelope, delivered by hand. Inside, copies of internal communications, operational routes, safe house locations, the names of 3 associates. All of it passed to the Calabrese family, a rival organization that had been circling Moretti territory for years. 2 weeks after the leak, 3 of his men were dead. An ambush on a road that only 6 people knew about. Elisa's name was in the file, twice, with evidence that looked on its surface like a thing you could not argue with. Lorenzo sat with that file for 1 night only. By morning, he had made his decision. He didn't confront her. He didn't ask for an explanation. Men like Lorenzo Moretti did not ask for explanations. They made decisions, and then they lived inside them. Her number was changed. Her access was removed. His people were instructed never to accept contact from her. It was, from his perspective, the only logical response to an act of betrayal. He told himself it hadn't broken him. He told himself that every day for 7 years, and he had almost started to believe it. He had never been with another woman. He had never explained that to anyone. He told himself it was discipline. He told himself it was focus. He knew, in the part of himself that he didn't examine, that it was neither of those things. The anonymous invitation had arrived 8 days ago. A single card, no return address, 4 words and a date, a wedding you should witness. He had thrown it away. He had retrieved it from the bin 3 hours later. He had told himself he was going because it was suspicious, because someone wanted him there, and he needed to understand why. He told himself it was strategic. He was lying to himself, and he knew it. He stood inside the cathedral now, at the back, and looked at the altar. He looked at the woman in the white dress, who had stopped walking when he walked in. He looked at the flowers and the light and the 200 people who were watching him with held breath. He felt nothing, or he told himself he felt nothing, which was close enough. He had confirmed what he came to confirm. She had moved on. The world had continued. He was a ghost at a party no one had actually invited him to. Not really, not for any reason that mattered. He turned to leave, and that was the moment everything changed. He had already turned. His hand was moving toward the door. His mind was already outside, already in the car, already constructing the drive back to a life that made sense. He had done what he came to do. He had looked. He had felt the dull, manageable ache of a thing that was finished. He was leaving. And then something moved at the edge of his vision. Small. Quiet. A shape that hadn't been there a moment ago. A little girl had stepped out from behind the bride's dress. Lorenzo stopped. He didn't decide to stop. His body simply ceased moving, the way a machine stops when something fundamental inside it fails. He stood with his hand still half raised toward the door and stared at the child who was staring back at him. She was 6, maybe just past it. Dark hair pulled into 2 uneven braids, the kind a child does herself or a mother does in a hurry. She wore a small white dress with a sash that had come slightly loose on one side. She was holding a single white rose by the stem, turning it slowly in both hands, the way children hold things they've been told are important. She was looking at him with the particular fearlessness of a child who has not yet learned which strangers to be afraid of. Lorenzo looked at her face, and the world went very, very still. He had spent 38 years reading rooms, reading people, reading situations with the speed and accuracy of a mind built for survival. In the time it took most men to register a threat, he had already assessed it, categorized it, and decided his response. That was not a skill. That was simply what he was. But his mind, in this moment, produced nothing, because the face looking back at him was not a stranger's face. The eyes, dark, slightly wide set, with that particular quality of stillness that people always called intensity and never knew what to do with. His eyes. The jaw, still soft with childhood, but already carrying a sharpness underneath. The bone structure that would arrive fully in 10 years and announce itself without apology. His jaw. And the dimple, left cheek only, barely visible unless she smiled. The one he had seen in exactly one place his entire life. His own mirror. The little girl tilted her head, and then, in a voice that was perfectly clear and perfectly calm and perfectly devastating, she spoke 7 words into the silence of the cathedral. "Mommy, is that my real daddy?" Nobody moved. The kind of silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something, a weight that settled over 200 people simultaneously and held them exactly where they were. A grandmother in the 3rd pew pressed both hands over her mouth. The groom had gone the color of the marble floor. Elisa's face, which had been so carefully composed through the trembling and the stopping and the long, terrible moment of recognition, collapsed, all at once, like something had been removed from behind it. Lorenzo did not look at any of them. He looked at the child, and somewhere beneath the locked chest and the blank mind and the 7 years of walls built so carefully they had become architecture. One word formed. Not a thought. Not a decision. Something older and quieter than either. Mine. He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing that frightened everyone, more than anything else he could have done. A man like Lorenzo Moretti shouting would have been manageable. Shouting was emotion, and emotion was readable, and readable things could be handled. But he simply turned from the child, looked at the room with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing, and spoke in a voice so controlled it had the quality of something just before it breaks. "I need a room. 5 minutes. Just her." The groom, Marco, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who filled a doorway, stepped forward. His jaw was set. His hands were at his sides but not relaxed. "You don't get to walk in here and make demands. This is our—" Lorenzo looked at him. Just looked at him. Marco stopped speaking, not because Lorenzo had threatened him, not because of anything said, simply because there are men in the world whose attention, when it turns fully toward you, makes every instinct you possess say, "Not today." Marco was not a coward. He was a reasonable person correctly reading an unreasonable situation. He stepped back. Someone found a vestibule off the left side of the nave, a small anteroom with dark wood panels and a narrow window, and the leftover quiet of a space that existed to be passed through. Lorenzo went in. Elisa followed. The door closed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elisa had not wiped her face. She stood in her wedding dress, with mascara tracking carefully down one cheek and her bouquet still in her hands, because she had forgotten it was there. And she looked at him, the way people look at things they have been rehearsing for years and are suddenly terrified they will say wrong. Lorenzo spoke first, quietly, her name. Sophia. Elisa's voice was barely there. She's 6. He absorbed that. She's mine. It wasn't a question. Elisa answered it anyway. Yes. The bouquet lowered slightly in her hands. She drew a breath that came out unsteady at both ends. And then she told him. The night he had cut her off. The night his number changed, and his doors closed, and his name became a thing she was no longer allowed to reach. She had already known she was pregnant. 3 days. She'd had the test for 3 days and hadn't told him yet because she was waiting for the right moment, because she was happy and she wanted the telling of it to be something they would both remember well. She called. The number was dead. She called again from a different phone. Dead. She went to his offices on the Via Condoti, the legitimate front, the place she had been to a dozen times before. The man at the door had looked at her with no expression and said 4 words. Mr. Moretti has no interest. She had asked him to pass a message. He had closed the door. She wrote a letter. She addressed it correctly. She sent it through channels that had worked before. It came back to her 3 weeks later, unopened, her own handwriting still on the front. So she built a life. She moved to a smaller city. She taught her classes and raised her daughter, and told Sophia, when Sophia was old enough to ask, that her father was a complicated man who didn't know she existed, not a monster, not absent by choice, just unreached. She had protected Sophia the only way she knew how, by keeping her invisible to a world that would have used her as a lever the moment anyone realized who her father was. Lorenzo listened to all of it without moving. And then Elisa said the thing she had carried alone for 7 years. The thing she had never had proof of. The thing she had told herself, in the darkest version of the story, was maybe just what she needed to believe to survive. She hadn't betrayed him. She had never passed information to anyone. She didn't know operational routes. She didn't have access to safe house locations. The life he kept and the life they shared had been 2 separate things. He had made sure of that, always, not because he didn't trust her, but because he wanted her untouched by it. The file that carried her name had come from inside his own organization. Someone who knew what the evidence needed to look like. Someone who understood exactly how Lorenzo Moretti would respond to proof of betrayal. That he would not ask, would not verify, would simply close the door and never open it again. They had built the frame around her perfectly, because they had built it for him. She had no proof then. She had no proof now. She was standing in a vestibule in a wedding dress, telling him this because he was here, and Sophia had asked her question, and there was nothing left to protect anymore. She finished speaking. The room held the silence. Lorenzo stood completely still. Not the stillness of a man in control. He had lost control of this room the moment a 6-year-old spoke 7 words into a cathedral. This was a different stillness. The stillness of a man watching the entire architecture of 7 years. Every wall, every decision, every cold and careful thing he had told himself was reasonable. Come apart at the seams, brick by brick, in real time. He did not speak. There were no words yet for what was happening inside him. There were only the pieces of a story he thought he knew, rearranging themselves into something he had never once considered, because he had never given her the chance to tell it. Someone had taken Sophia outside while the adults talked, a cousin or an aunt, someone whose job it had become to manage the unmanageable afternoon this wedding had turned into. The cathedral garden was small and walled, with a stone bench and an old olive tree, and the kind of quiet that exists just outside, places where people have gathered to feel things. Sophia was crouching near the base of the tree when Lorenzo came through the side door, examining something in the dirt with the focused intensity children bring to things that adults have long since stopped noticing. She looked up when she heard him. She didn't startle, didn't retreat, just looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, and then looked back at whatever was on the ground, then back at him again, as though she was cross-referencing something. Lorenzo stopped a few feet away. He had sat across from a federal prosecutor for 6 hours without once looking uncomfortable. He had delivered news that broke men and received news that would have broken others, and conducted himself throughout with the particular composure that had become, over 38 years, less a choice and more a condition of his existence. He could not, in this moment, locate a single word. Sophia stood up, brushed the dirt from the skirt of her white dress with the brisk efficiency of a child who does this often, and studied his face the way children study things that feel familiar before they understand why. "Do you know how to braid hair?" she asked. Lorenzo blinked. "What?" "Braid hair." She said it patiently, as though he might simply not have heard. "Mine keeps coming out. Aunt Rosa did it, but she's not very good." He stopped. "No." She considered this with great seriousness, then apparently decided it was an acceptable limitation. "Mommy cries sometimes," she said, shifting subjects the way only children can, without transition, without warning, without any apparent awareness that she had just detonated something. "When she thinks I'm asleep. Not always. Just sometimes." Lorenzo said nothing. She took a step closer and looked up at him with her head tilted, examining his face the way she had examined the thing in the dirt, with patience and real curiosity, and no self-consciousness whatsoever. Then she reached up. Her small fingers touched the scar above his left eyebrow, the one he'd carried since he was 19, a thin white line that had become so familiar he had stopped registering it in mirrors years ago. "Does that hurt?" she asked. "No," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then, without any particular change in tone, "Mommy says lies make your tummy hurt." Something shifted in his chest, not painfully, just shifted, the way furniture moves in a room when you finally let light in after a long time. He almost smiled. The almost of it was its own kind of ache. He crouched down to her level slowly, the way large men crouch when they are being careful not to frighten something small. She didn't step back. She looked at him from this new angle, with the same calm assessment, reached out, and took his hand, not asking, not hesitating, simply taking it the way children take things they've decided belong to them. Lorenzo looked down at her hand in his, then up at the cathedral wall, pale stone against a blue afternoon sky. He made a decision. Not the kind of decision he was known for. Not the cold, strategic 3 steps ahead calculations that had built an empire and kept it standing. This decision had nothing to do with power. It had nothing to do with control. It had everything to do with the 6-year-old who was still holding his hand and had gone back to examining something near the base of the olive tree, entirely unbothered, as though the two of them had always done this. As though this were simply what Sunday afternoons looked like. He made the call from the garden wall, far enough from the bench where Sophia was now sitting that she couldn't hear him, close enough that he could still see her. 2 rings, then a voice, careful, alert, already reading the silence before Lorenzo had said a word. "Nico. Boss. 7 years ago." Lorenzo kept his voice low and entirely level. "A file was delivered to me, evidence regarding Elisa Ferrante, I want to know who built it. I want to know who delivered it. I want a name by tonight. A pause. Not hesitation. Nico didn't hesitate. Processing. Tonight. Tonight. He ended the call. He stood with the phone in his hand and looked at Sophia, who had found a flat stone and was now arranging smaller stones around it in a pattern that had clear internal logic and no obvious external purpose. He watched her for a moment. Then he turned back to the wall and began to reconstruct. Someone inside his organization had wanted Elisa gone. That much was now certain. The file had been too precise, too well constructed, too fluent in the specific language of Moretti operational security to have come from outside. Whoever built it knew which routes were sensitive, knew which names would land hardest, knew exactly how to format evidence so that it looked like the kind of thing you didn't question. Because in his world, that kind of thing was rarely fabricated. It was rarely worth the risk. They had also known something more important than any operational detail. They had known him. They had known that Lorenzo Moretti, presented with apparent proof of betrayal by the one person he had ever fully trusted, would not investigate, would not confront, would not allow the possibility that the evidence was wrong, because allowing that possibility meant sitting inside the uncertainty of it. And that was the one thing he had never learned how to do. Show him she was a leak. Let his own loyalty to his principles do the rest. No violence, no exposure. Clean hands on a clean exit. It was elegant in the way that truly malicious things sometimes are. His phone rang 40 minutes later. Nico's voice was measured, which meant what he had found was not. You have a name. Say it. Dario Conti. The garden went very quiet. Dario Conti, his underboss for a decade, the man who had sat at his right hand through 3 territorial disputes, 2 federal investigations, and the kind of sustained pressure that revealed what people were actually made of. The man he had trusted with information that he had trusted to no one else. The man who had stood at his shoulder at his father's funeral and said, with what Lorenzo had taken at the time for sincerity, "The organization is in good hands." Nico continued, careful, precise. He left the organization 2 years after the Ferrante situation, retired to a villa outside Lucca. The property records took some digging. A pause. It was purchased through a holding company that traces back to the Calabresi family. The Calabresi family, the rival organization that had received the leaked information, the one that had used it to set an ambush on a road that only 6 people had known about. Lorenzo stood completely still. Dario hadn't just framed Elisa. He had sold the routes himself to the Calabresi for a price that had apparently included a Tuscan villa and a quiet retirement. He had handed over real intelligence, real routes, real names, and then constructed a paper trail pointing at a primary school teacher from Florence who had no idea any of it existed. He had collected payment from both sides of the transaction, and then he had watched, from his comfortable distance, as Lorenzo dismantled the one good thing in his life with his own hands, convinced, as he always was, that he was being ruthlessly rational. Dario had not just betrayed the organization. He had weaponized Lorenzo's love against him, had turned the precision of his own grief into the instrument of his punishment, had stood close enough to watch it happen and said nothing, for 10 years, then 2 more in retirement, then 5 beyond that. While a woman raised a child alone and a man built walls around a wound he didn't know was inflicted. Lorenzo looked at Sophia. She had finished her stone arrangement and was now looking at it with her head tilted, deciding if it was complete. He raised the phone. Nico. Yes. 4 words, spoken the way Lorenzo Moretti spoke all consequential things. Quietly, without inflection, without any of the heat that the moment might have justified. Bring him to me. The call ended. He put the phone in his jacket pocket and stood at the garden wall for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular, letting the information settle into its permanent place in his understanding of things. In the world Lorenzo Moretti came from, there was only one rule above all others. Not territory, not silence, not the careful management of power across generations. One rule, the first rule, the rule everything else was built on: loyalty. Dario Conti had not simply broken it. He had studied it, understood it, and used it as the weapon. And now, on a Tuesday afternoon in a cathedral garden in Rome, with a child arranging stones near an olive tree 20 feet away, Dario Conti had just learned what happened when you broke it. He found Elisa in the anteroom where he had left her. She had wiped her face, fixed what could be fixed. She was standing at the narrow window with her arms folded across her chest, not closed off, just holding herself together the way people do when they have spent everything they had and are waiting to find out if it was enough. She turned when he came in. She didn't speak. She had said everything there was to say, and she knew, the way people who have loved someone deeply always know, that whatever happened next belonged to him. Lorenzo stood in the center of the room. He was not the man who had walked into that cathedral an hour ago. That man had come for closure, for the clean final confirmation that a chapter was finished and the page could turn. That man had a version of events he had lived inside for 7 years, a story with clear roles and a clear ending, a wound that had calcified into something almost manageable. That man was gone. What stood in the anteroom now was something Lorenzo Moretti had very little experience being, a person who had been wrong, not outmaneuvered, not caught off guard by an enemy, wrong in the private, irreversible way that has nothing to do with intelligence or power and everything to do with what you choose when you are in pain. He didn't reach for her, didn't move toward her at all. "I closed the door," he said. "I didn't check who was behind it. That cost you 7 years. He paused. "And it cost me a daughter I didn't know existed. I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm just saying it out loud, because you deserved to hear it 7 years ago and I was too certain of myself to offer it." Elisa's jaw tightened. Her eyes were bright, but she didn't look away. The door opened behind him. Marco. He had changed out of his jacket. He stood in the doorway with the particular composure of a man who has decided to handle an impossible situation with as much dignity as it will allow. He looked at Elisa first, checking her, the way people look at the ones they love when the room has been dangerous, and then at Lorenzo. Lorenzo turned to face him fully. He looked at this man. This architect from Verona, or wherever he was from, who had shown up in the years after Lorenzo vanished and built something real with a woman who had every reason to trust no one, who had presumably braided Sophia's hair with more competence than Lorenzo ever would, who had been standing at an altar in his wedding suit when the worst possible version of his wedding day walked through the back doors. Lorenzo held his gaze for a long moment. "She deserves what you've given her," he said. The words cost him something. He felt the cost of them exactly, the way you feel the specific weight of a thing you are setting down after carrying it a long time without admitting it was heavy. Marco said nothing, but something in his posture shifted, not softening, not hardening, just acknowledging. Lorenzo looked back at Elisa. "Sophia is my daughter. I'm not going to disappear again. I won't do that to her. But I'm also not here to dismantle what you've built." He kept his voice even, careful. "I'm asking for a presence. Slow. On your terms. No part of my world enters hers until I have made it safe enough to do so. You have my word on that. And whatever my word is worth to you right now, It is the only thing I have to offer." Elisa looked at him for a long time. She didn't forgive him. He hadn't asked her to, and she was too honest to offer it before it was real. But she gave him something smaller and more immediate than forgiveness. She nodded. 40 minutes later, the wedding resumed. It was quieter than it had begun. The easy celebration of the morning had been replaced by something more deliberate, more conscious. The way gatherings feel after something real has happened inside them. The string quartet played again. The guests reassembled with the slightly stunned politeness of people who have witnessed something they will be explaining for years. Lorenzo stood at the very back of the cathedral, beside one of the stone pillars, and watched Elisa walk the aisle. She walked toward Marco. She kept her eyes forward. She was steady. He watched her, and he waited for the thing he had been bracing for all afternoon. The loss, the old familiar grief dressed in new clothes, the confirmation that this was the cost of every wrong decision. It didn't come. What came instead, quietly and without announcement, was something he hadn't felt in 7 years and almost didn't recognize. Relief. She was safe. She was loved. Sophia was real and was in the garden with someone's aunt and had taken his hand without asking. And somewhere between Rome and Tuscany, Dario Conti was already being collected. Lorenzo stood against the pillar and watched the woman he had loved get married, and breathed out slowly, and let it be exactly what it was. 3 weeks later, Dario Conti retired permanently. The details belong to a different kind of story. This one doesn't need them. All that matters, all that ever really matters in the end, is that the account was settled. 7 years of silence. 3 dead men on a road outside Naples. A woman raising a child alone in a city far from the life that had been taken from her. A father who never knew his daughter's name. Dario Conti had added all of that up carefully, over many years, from a villa paid for by people he had served better than the man who trusted him most. The retirement was permanent. The villa is no longer occupied. That chapter is closed. Every Sunday, a car arrives at a small park in the Prati district of Rome. Not a black car, a dark gray one, unremarkable, the kind that disappears in traffic without effort. One man gets out. No visible security, no earpieces, no particular indication of who he is to anyone passing by. He wears a gray sweater on cold days, a plain jacket when it's mild. He has been observed by anyone who happened to notice, sitting on a bench near the fountain, waiting. A few minutes later, a woman arrives with a small girl. The small girl does not wait. She walks directly to the man on the bench and presents whatever she has decided is important that week. A drawing, a complaint about something that happened at school, a rock with an unusual shape, a question she has been saving. The man receives all of these things with complete seriousness. He has been learning, slowly and badly, to braid hair. The results are uneven. The 6-year-old finds this genuinely funny in a way she doesn't try to hide. He is getting slightly better. Slightly. One Sunday in October, Sophia sat beside him on the bench and was quiet for a moment in the way she was sometimes quiet, not distracted, just thinking, arriving at something from the inside. "Are you going to live with us?" she asked. Lorenzo looked at her. He considered, for exactly one moment, the many things a person could say in response to that question. The complicated things, the careful things, the things that were technically accurate and emotionally evasive. He said none of them. "No," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere either." Sophia received this information. She turned it over. She looked at the fountain for a few seconds with the focused seriousness of a person reviewing a contract. "Okay," she said, "but you have to come to my school play. I'm a tree." "A tree? An important tree?" She looked at him sideways. "You have to clap loud." I can do that. He attended the school play on a Thursday evening in November. He sat in a plastic chair in a gymnasium that smelled like chalk dust and floor cleaner, surrounded by parents holding phones aloft and grandparents leaning forward in their seats, and he watched his daughter stand on a low wooden stage in a costume made of green paper leaves that were already coming unstuck on one side. Sophia stood very still, in the way children stand still when they are concentrating enormously hard on standing still. She had one line. She delivered it with total conviction. She found him in the audience from the stage. He saw the exact moment she located him, the small adjustment in her posture, the way she stood a fraction straighter. He clapped loud. It was the only room he had ever been in where he felt completely powerless and completely at peace at the same time. No control over anything, no advantage, no walls, no leverage, no position to defend. Just a man in a plastic chair who had almost missed this, who had been 7 years and one anonymous envelope away from never knowing it existed. Lorenzo Moretti had built an empire on control, on never being caught off guard, on reading every room before he walked into it, assessing every threat before it could fully form, staying precisely 3 steps ahead of everything that might undo him. He had spent 38 years constructing a version of himself that was not vulnerable to surprise, not reachable, not the kind of man who could be undone by something as simple as love or loss or a door closed too quickly without checking what it was keeping out. And then, a 6-year-old girl in a paper leaf costume had walked onto a gymnasium stage and looked for him in the audience. She gave him back the part of himself he thought Elisa had taken. The part that could still be broken open by something ordinary and good. The part that could still be saved by something as unremarkable as a Sunday afternoon and a small hand in his, and the terrible patient work of showing up. The greatest betrayal of his life had never been the file. It had never been the frame-up, or the 7 lost years, or the name that came back from Nico's investigation, like a stone dropped into still water. It had been the wall he had built so carefully, so completely, with such absolute and practiced conviction, that it had almost kept out the only thing that had ever actually mattered. Almost. He was still the most feared man in Italy, but on Sunday afternoons, he was just Sophia's dad.